Alright, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the evolution of The Lord of the Rings. How Tolkien wrote it. And it's just going to be like kind of an overview. It's not going to be too much of a deep dive. Just enough for a small video. Now, there are people out there who do know about this. If you have read volumes 6 to 9 of the History of Middle-earth, it details all of that whole writing. His writing process has all these different drafts that he wrote. Now, to understand this, you got to remember he was working on the Silmarillion, and at the time, he was telling his children bedtime stories. One of them happened to be about a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins. He then wrote it down as a book, published it, and it was successful. His publishers asked him to come up with a sequel or a successor to The Hobbit. He didn't want to do a sequel because, the book made it very clear. He lived happily ever after to the end of his days. So he didn't want to write a sequel. He did send some material to his publishers. That included the Silmarillion and Farmer Giles of Ham. But it was rejected, so he went and sat down and wrote the first chapter of what would become The Lord of the Rings. Now, this was in 1937. That's when Hobbit was published in September. He wrote the first chapter a couple months later in December. Didn't really know where to go with the story. Wrote different drafts of that first chapter. Bilbo wasn't supposed to go on other adventures, so he's like, okay, well, what about Bilbo has a son? Bingo. Or maybe Bilbo should go on another adventure, but it'd be about finding another treasure. Decided, at one point, wrote down, well, what about the ring? That probably should be tied in with this. And so a story developed. Bingo became Bilbo's nephew instead of his son. Later changed to Frodo. When he first started writing, he had no idea where Gandalf had disappeared to, what was keeping him. Had no idea who the Black Riders were. And every time he would get to a certain point, he'd stop, go back, rewrite what he had, continue the story on. They go to the village of Bree, meet a hobbit named Trotter, whose real name is Peregrine Boffin, who wears wooden shoes. Trotter, of course, eventually becomes a man. Later changed to Strider, which we know is Aragorn. And then, Tolkien would come to a certain point, and he would stop. He got to about the point where they were going down the Great River, and the breaking of the Fellowship, and he paused. A year or two went by, picked it back up, and this often happened with him. He had other duties besides just writing this book. He had a family to take care of. He had a job. So he was very busy, but took what time he could to write. And as he writes The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion even starts to change. Of course, the Noldoran Elvish language would become Sindarin out of this. Gandalf, of course, decides that he was going to be imprisoned by a human giant named Treebeard, which we know would become a walking, talking tree later on, and would be a good guy, not a bad guy. And of course, you have Saruman getting introduced into the story. He's the real reason why Gandalf has been held up, because he's been holding Gandalf prisoner. And so, throughout the 1940s, World War II, he was working on Lord of the Rings. Finished it, then had to go and revise it, get it ready for publication, write the appendices, and an index, which he never finished, because it delayed the third volume. So he had to scrap the index. There was an index in The Lord of the Rings, but it wasn't the fully detailed one he wanted to have. But I think what he did write has been published. What is it? Tolkien Compass. There's another work too. Trying to think, I can't remember the name of it, but so he abandoned that idea. Christopher did use it for the Silmarillion when he published that. And of course, after Lord of the Rings was written, he had to rewrite the Silmarillion to try to get it publishable, but also fit the Lord of the Rings. He even had to take The Hobbit off the shelves and fix Chapter 5, where Bilbo meets Gollum, because originally Gollum was just going to give Bilbo the ring just for winning the riddle game, instead of what we read of and what happens in Lord of the Rings. So Tolkien had to revise that and said, well, here's what really happened. Bilbo made up the story of it being a gift, only because the ring was starting to take a hold of him. His publishers, asked him to split Lord of the Rings into 3 volumes, which he was against. It was 1 book. But there was a paper shortage, and it would have cost a lot of money to print it as is. So he went to another publisher, Collins Publishing, which later merged with Allen and Unwin, Tolkien's publishers, and others, which is now HarperCollins. So he wanted also the Silmarillion to be published alongside Lord of the Rings. They didn't want to do that either, because again, it cost too much money. There was a paper shortage. So he went to Collins, and Collins said, "Oh yeah, we'll publish Lord of the Rings as 1 volume and the Silmarillion along with it." As time passed, of course, eventually, they were like, "Well, Lord of the Rings needs to be cut down. Silmarillion needs to be cut down." So he's like, "Okay, well, forget it." So he went back to Allen and Unwin, split the Lord of the Rings up into 3 volumes. They published, the first 2 in 54 and the last one in 55. And, throughout the rest of his lifetime, he did have to tweak and revise Lord of the Rings a little bit, because there were some inconsistencies, in topography and with concerning the map and everything, and some other stuff. But it was finally fixed. 1 volume edition of Lord of the Rings did eventually get published in the 1960s as its popularity grew. It was very popular among hippies and, in college, on college campuses, the anti-war movement, because, you had Vietnam going on at the time. And yeah, that's pretty much how it was all done. And one of the greatest books ever written. It is my favorite, always will be my favorite, as I have said before. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. And talk to you next time. Have a good day.